There are truths buried in history that were never meant to be unearthed, and when you hear them, your heart does not simply beat. It trembles like a prisoner, shaking its chains in the dark. Imagine a house in colonial America, grand on the outside, yet rotten with secrets within, where the blood of children became currency, and where siblings who should never have touched sealed a covenant of flesh for power. The year is 1853, and behind the blackened windows of Harrington Manor stood Ezekiel and Judith. Harrington's siblings, bound not by love, but by ambition. Their whispers turned into vows, their vows into a lineage cursed from the moment of conception, for their children born of this unholy union carried the deformities of a choice that spit in the face of nature. You were never supposed to hear about them, not the way I am about to tell you, because the records were buried, burned, and rewritten to erase the shame. But fire leaves ash, and the ash tells the truth in fragments. The story of twin sons Gabriel and Raphael Harrington born under candlelight, while priests muttered prayers that were drowned out by the screams of a mother who had already become more conspirator than parent. Their bodies twisted their forms marked by the very bloodline that created them. The town called it God's punishment. But what if it was not punishment at all? What if it was a mirror held to the darkest human ambition? The Harrington siblings did not see their children as children. They saw them as proof of their own defiance, and they locked them away in an attic cage where the sound of their breathing was the only evidence of their existence. The town was told the twins had died, and in a way they had for what is a life, when it is stripped of sunlight, when your childhood is reduced to the shadows on a wooden wall, when every voice you hear is only your own, echoed back through silence. These were not children to Ezekiel and Judith. They were leverage in a scheme that would stretch beyond blood into power property and the control of fear itself. But why keep them alive? Why feed two broken bodies, when death would have been easier? Because in the grotesque eyes of the Harringtons, the twins were more valuable, alive as silent prisoners than dead. They were living insurance policies, testimonies that could never be spoken, locked in an attic that became a grave without dirt. This was not just incest. This was not just cruelty. This was a plan sharpened into a weapon, a legacy written not in scripture, but in screams carried by the wind through the broken shutters of Harrington Manor. And now, after centuries of silence, that wind carries the truth to you. And once you hear it, you cannot go back. The attic was their kingdom and their prison, a space where wood rotted slow and air grew heavy with the smell of mildew and candle smoke. The twins Gabriel and Raphael were chained not by iron, but by neglect, fed just enough to keep their hearts beating, denied everything that could remind them they were human. Outside, the townspeople carried on their lives, never daring to question why no children's laughter came from the Harrington estate. Only silence punctuated by an occasional wail at night, which the family dismissed as the cries of owls or the howls of wind. Imagine the darkness a child's eyes adjusting to a world where the ceiling leaks and rats become companions, where the body grows twisted, not just from birth, but from starvation and the cruel shaping of despair. Every bone curved by malnutrition, every muscle stiff from stillness, and yet the mind still sharp, still watching, still remembering. This was the cruelest trick of all. The Harringtons did not raise broken minds, only broken bodies. They wanted witnesses trapped in flesh too frail to escape, but eyes clear enough to see everything. The siblings' marriage was never about lust. It was about empire, property, lands, inheritance, the weaving of bloodlines to keep wealth locked inside their name. And to do this, they played God. They birthed children not for love, but for legacy. And when that legacy appeared flawed, deformed, unfit, they did not discard it. They turned it into silence, and silence became their ally, because while the twins remained locked away, the Harringtons built their power in the courts, in the churches, and in the very fabric of colonial law. What no one outside the manor walls knew was that Ezekiel and Judith were using the children as pawns, not in life, but in death. Insurance papers, falsified wills, estates signed away under claims of tragedy. Every ounce of suffering upstairs, feeding into profit downstairs, while the A-Town thought the siblings were holy and chosen blessed with prosperity. They were siphoning wealth through blood contracts and legal manipulation. This was the machinery of corruption, hidden beneath a roof that sagged with secrets. And the children in that attic, Gabriel and Raphael, they grew not just in body, but in awareness. They heard the footsteps of visitors, the bribed officials, the whispered plans. They knew more than anyone believed, and in their silence, they became the most dangerous witnesses alive. Because no matter how twisted their forms, their memories were perfect, their eyes were sharper than any knife, and their existence was the one truth Ezekiel and Judith could never fully bury. The Harrington estate stood like a monument to piety, its grand windows glowing with candlelight on Sunday evenings, its halls echoing with the voices of priests, judges, and merchants who came to feast and pray and conspire. But what those visitors never saw was the crawl space above their heads, where two children listened through cracks in the wood. Every hymn, every toast, every whisper of strategy filtered upward like poison seeping into the air. Gabriel and Raphael did not need books to learn. They were taught by the very corruption that thought itself hidden. The town saw Ezekiel as a man of law, his voice guiding trials, his hands signing verdicts. They saw Judith as a woman of virtue, her presence in church, a reminder of purity. But behind closed doors, these siblings wrote death sentences, not upon parchment alone, but upon flesh. They twisted accusations of witchcraft into weapons. Each trial, a stage where fear was sold as justice, and every condemned soul left behind, land, money, property, all swallowed by the Harrington Empire. The attic children heard it all. They memorized names, crimes, profits, the rhythm of corruption. The power of the Harringtons lay not in strength, but in manipulation. They understood the architecture of fear. They knew that a whisper of witchcraft spread faster than truth, that the sight of a neighbor burning could silence a village, and so they turned paranoia into profit, while the town thought itself righteous. It was merely a market of souls traded like grain and timber. The bodies of the condemned became stepping stones in the Harrington rise. Meanwhile, Gabriel and Raphael endured their silent apprenticeship of horror. Every time a church bell rang, it was not just a signal of worship. It was a marker of another trial, another family broken, another secret hidden beneath robes of false holiness. Their bodies may have been twisted by birth, but their minds sharpened again. As the whetstone of injustice, every scream they heard became another cut upon their memory, until they were carved into living records of everything their parents sought to erase. And it is here that the horror deepens, not because of what Ezekiel and Judith did in public, but because of what they did in private. Every false prayer, every staged blessing, every false comfort they gave to the condemned was practiced and perfected in the same house where their children sat in filth upstairs. The duplicity was total, and the children understood what no villager could ever guess, that evil does not come cloaked in shadow. It comes wrapped in ritual, sanctified by fear and fed by silence. The deeper one looks into the Harrington legacy, the clearer it becomes that their empire was built, not on strength of arms, but on mastery of perception. Ezekiel knew the courtroom better than any soldier knew the battlefield he wielded. Words like blades, each accusation of witchcraft, a calculated strike designed to strip a family of its name, its land, its honor. Judith played her role with equal precision, her gentle hand upon a grieving widow, her quiet prayer whispered over a condemned soul. Her face was the mask that concealed the machinery of murder. Behind the walls of Harrington Manor, ledgers grew thick with entries, each name recorded with care, each property mapped with precision. The attic children would one day be found, surrounded by these documents scattered like confessions across the rotten floorboards. But long before that discovery, they knew the sound of pen scratching parchment. They could hear their parents dividing spoils even as the church bells outside tolled for another execution. The villagers did not suspect, because they did not want to suspect. Fear made them pliable. Fear made them obedient. The Harringtons understood this and nurtured it. They turned every whispered suspicion into a spectacle, every flicker of doubt into evidence, every strange sickness or failed crop into proof that Satan walked among them, and only the Harringtons with their wisdom, their connections, their holy theater could deliver salvation. Meanwhile, Gabriel and Raphael remained in their prison shaped by hunger, cold and silence. But even in their suffering, they were being forged the same way. Iron is hardened in fire. Every insult, every blow, every day spent in darkness only made their awareness sharper. Their bodies bore deformity, but their minds became instruments of memory, precise, unyielding, merciless. They saw the patterns their parents thought invisible, and in silence, they understood what narrations of villagers never would, that the trial was never about witchcraft. The trial was always about wealth. This is why the attic matters not just as a chamber of cruelty, but as a witness to history. It was there that the true story of the Harrington dynasty was preserved. Not in law books, not in church records, not in the gossip of neighbors, but in the minds of two broken children who saw through the masks of power. The attic became the archive of a corruption so vast that when it finally unraveled, it would not simply destroy a family, it would rip open the illusion of justice that had governed a colony for decades. The Harringtons were not the first to twist scripture into chains, but few wielded religion with such cold calculation. Ezekiel learned early that the pulpit carried more power than the sword, and Judith perfected the art of appearing saintly. Their partnership was a theater of sanctity, behind which murder thrived. The villagers saw sermons. They saw prayers. They saw fasting and charity. What they did not see was how each ritual was a tool of control, each hymn, a mask, each confession, a weapon. Judith knew how to listen to whispers. She would sit beside grieving wives and fearful mothers, nodding her head as secrets spilled from trembling lips. She collected these stories not to comfort, but to craft narratives of accusation. By the time Ezekiel stood in court, the case was already won, because the foundation had been laid in bedrooms and kitchens, in hushed conversations around hearth fires. Every candlelit prayer was a net, and the people stepped into it willingly. The church itself became a stage for their manipulation. Candles burned longer when they wanted to inspire. Awe bells rang louder when they wished to summon dread. Scriptures were bent and twisted until they carried meanings. Ezekiel needed words about sin, became words about enemies. Words about redemption became words about obedience. Villagers who questioned too much suddenly found themselves under suspicion. Their children stared at with fearful eyes. Their fields prayed over with deliberate menace, until the harvest failed and proof of their guilt was declared undeniable. Inside the manor, the twins listened to the rehearsals. They could hear their parents practicing tones of false compassion, adjusting the cadence of sermons as though truth could be manufactured like theater. Their mother's gentle sobs, her pauses, her sighs, these were rehearsed like lines in a play. Their father's thunderous condemnations each carefully timed to leave. No room for doubt. What the people thought was divine inspiration was in fact choreography. The attic became their vantage point, though chained and beaten. Gabriel and Raphael pieced together the game. They saw how religion became currency, how sermons became contracts, how scripture itself was turned into a ledger of power and punishment, while the village believed they were fighting Satan. The Harringtons had made themselves gods in flesh, wielding faith as their weapon, and cloaking greed in the garments of piety. The first cracks appeared not in the courtroom, but in the whispers carried by the wind. The Harringtons had built their empire on fear. But fear is a fire, and fires consume more than intended. A villager who once believed now hesitated when Judith's words no longer soothed, but stung, when Ezekiel's thunderous sermons felt less like prophecy and more like threats. Small doubts took root like seeds in soil too long suppressed. It began with the missing children. Questions hushed but never silenced families, who whispered of little ones disappearing after being called to the Harrington manor. Promises of healing, gone unanswered by return of lifeless bodies wrapped in silence. Some parents, too terrified to speak, carried their grief behind shuttered windows. But grief leaks it, stains the edges of words, until neighbors notice that sorrow repeats itself, in patterns too precise to be chance. The court records that Ezekiel guarded with zeal began to unravel too. A clerk who had once been loyal realized signatures did not match. Property deeds were altered, Wills, rewritten to funnel land and livestock into Harrington hands. The deception too neat to be mistake. When he confided to a fellow villager, fear choked his voice. But truth had found its way into another's ear, and from that moment the illusion could never again be whole. Inside the manor, Gabriel and Raphael felt the shift. Their punishments grew harsher, the food thinner, the prayers longer, as though their parents sensed the world beyond the walls slipping from their control. Judith paced the halls at night, whispering prayers that sounded more like bargains. Ezekiel snapped at servants who once trembled, but now began to exchange glances filled with questions. The air grew heavier with suspicion, and the theater of perfection began to tear at the seams, yet the Harringtons did not crumble. Immediately, power rarely does they fought harder. Tighten, in the grip summoning more trials, feeding the fire with greater ferocity, but every scream, every false confession, every broken family only added to the weight pressing down upon them. The cracks were widening, and beneath the painted surface of holiness, the truth began to claw its way into the light. The storm broke, not with thunder, but with whispers turned into voices too many to ignore. A widow stood trembling before the congregation, her hands clutching a torn shawl as she spoke her truth. She had given her only daughter into the Harringtons' custody, believing their promise of healing, but the child never returned, and when she demanded answers, Ezekiel thundered about the will of God, while Judith promised silence was obedience, but the widow no longer bowed. Her silence ended in a single sentence that cracked the air like a blade. "They murdered my child." The villagers gasped, yet in that moment fear became fragile. Others rose hesitantly, one after another, voices carrying stories that had lived too long in the shadows, each tale a fragment of horror, children disappearing. Property stripped away, neighbors condemned for imagined witchcraft, only to see their homes burned and their land absorbed into Harrington control. Each story on its own, dismissed as misfortune. But together they painted a picture too monstrous to deny. Inside the manor, Ezekiel raged, his voice echoing through stone halls. His sermons turned violent, demanding obedience with every word Judith whispered in the dark, speaking of curses and vengeance, while the twins listened from their corner, understanding for the first time that the world outside had begun to see what they had always known, that their parents' power was not divine, but a mask cracking under the weight of its own lies. The courts tried to silence the murmurs, but corruption once exposed breeds rot. Even the magistrates who had once benefited from Harrington gold found themselves questioned by neighbors who wondered why justice always favored the same family. Old ledgers began to surface, showing bribes hidden beneath careful ink, and one brave clerk smuggled documents into the hands of Father Thorne, whose suspicions had been sharpened into conviction by the growing tide of testimony. The village itself seemed to change at night. Shadows lingered longer, doors barred not against witches, but against the Harringtons themselves. Parents clutched their children tighter, as if Ezekiel and Judith had transformed from shepherds into wolves, and the manor looming against the horizon no longer stood as a symbol of power, but as a dark wound upon the land, bleeding secrets into the soil the fire was spreading, and it could not be contained. Father Thorne moved in silence, but every step carried the weight of centuries of suppressed defiance. He walked through the graveyard, where so many stones bore names of those condemned as witches, their deaths sealed by Harrington judgment. Yet as he placed his hand upon one weathered marker, he felt no curse, only the heavy truth that innocence had been buried under greed and superstition. It was there among the graves that he swore he would dismantle the Harrington Empire no matter the cost. By day he appeared as a humble priest, listening to confessions, delivering sermons on humility. But by night, his study became a chamber of war. He gathered names, records, testimonies, scraps of parchment written in trembling hands. He mapped the Harrington holdings, tracing every stolen acre, every silenced witness, every false trial that had fattened the siblings' power. He saw the pattern clearly, a web spun with meticulous cruelty, designed not only to enrich, but to control entire generations through fear. The twins Gabriel and Raphael watched him with silent curiosity from the shadows of the manor when he visited under the guise of spiritual counsel. They saw how his eyes lingered on the cracks in the walls, the hidden passages, the locked chambers. They saw how he spoke softly to Judith and Ezekiel, while hiding a storm of judgment beneath his calm tone. For the first time, they glimpsed an adult unafraid to look directly at their parents' corruption, and that glimmer of defiance etched itself into their hearts. Father Thorne's first strike was not public, but surgical. He began with whispers to trusted allies, men and women tired of being pawns in Harrington's schemes, a merchant ruined by false accusations, a farmer stripped of land, a mother who had buried her child after a Harrington trial. Each carried a wound, and in those wounds Thorne planted resolve together. They became his network gathering evidence. Under the cover of night smuggling testimonies into safe hands, far from Harrington influence, yet Ezekiel was no fool. His sermons grew harsher, his eyes scanning the congregation for traitors. Judith lit candles late into the night, chanting prayers laced with venom. The air around the manor thickened with paranoia. Punishments for servants became crueler, and the twins were reminded daily that even suspicion of betrayal could mean death. But the tide had already shifted. The people no longer bowed so easily. The Harrington grip had begun to slip, and Father Thorne was sharpening the blade that would cut it loose. The twins Gabriel and Raphael had grown up as silent ornaments of the Harrington estate, their twisted bodies displayed as proof of their parents' supposed curse-breaking power. Yet behind their wide eyes burned an intelligence sharper than the knives used to cut their food. They had been taught to fear. The world told that no one outside the manor would ever accept them. But in Father Thorne's gaze, they saw something different. He did not recoil at their forms, nor speak to them as broken creatures. He spoke as if they were whole, and in that simple recognition a fire was lit. At night, when Judith's hymns echoed through the manor, the twins whispered to each other beneath their blankets, trading fragments of memory, piecing together conversations they had overheard in the grand dining hall, the names of men. Their father bribed the locations of deeds. Their mother forged the secret room behind the library wall, where documents were kept. They realized their minds had become vaults, holding truths their parents believed too hidden for discovery, truths that could topple everything. It began with small acts, Gabriel slipping pages from their father's study into his sleeve, Raphael memorizing maps and reciting them later to Father Thorne under the cover of prayer confessions. Thorne pretended to bless while carefully writing each word into his hidden journal. These were not the acts of children. They were the acts of spies shaped by abuse, turned into weapons by desperation. But danger sharpened with every move. Ezekiel's sermons now thundered with warnings of traitors. Judith grew obsessed with omens, reading doom into every flicker of candlelight. The manor felt like a tightening noose, and the twins lived in constant fear of discovery. Yet their courage did not falter. They had tasted what it meant to be more than prisoners. They had seen that their minds could carve cracks into the stone walls of Poe. One night, Raphael asked a question that chilled Gabriel to his core. What if they already know? What if our parents suspect us and are only waiting to make us examples? Gabriel said nothing, but deep down he knew the truth. The Harringtons thrived on suspicion. They had built their empire by pitting neighbor against neighbor. Perhaps their parents already did know, but even so, the twins had crossed a threshold. There was no going back. Their silence had ended, and the reckoning was drawing near. The Harrington estate became a fortress of suspicion. Every door was bolted. Every servant watched with hawk eyes. Ezekiel prowled the halls at night, carrying a lantern like a hunter stalking prey. His voice no longer preached salvation, but damnation, filled with warnings of shadows and betrayal. His paranoia seeped into every brick. Judith meanwhile fasted until her body trembled, whispering curses over bowls of water, waiting for ripples to reveal the face of a traitor. Together, they turned the manor into a crucible of fear, where even silence felt dangerous. The twins felt the weight of every glance, a misplaced word, a cough at the wrong time could ignite their parents' wrath. Gabriel began hiding scraps of stolen parchment in the hollow of a cracked floorboard. Raphael pressed coded prayers into the margins of their psalters. Thorn received their secrets during confessions delivered in whispers so faint they seemed carried by the air itself. Still the noose grew tighter. Ezekiel had doubled the guards. Judith inspected the twins' rooms at random, lifting mattresses, checking closets, always searching, never satisfied. Father Thorn understood the danger, yet saw in it the opportunity of a lifetime. He began crafting his weapon, not with steel, but with ink. He gathered land deeds, forged contracts, records of bribes, testimonies of servants, too frightened to speak aloud, but willing to nod in agreement. When he pressed them, he knew that a single accusation would collapse under the Harrington influence. But a mountain of evidence, a storm too vast to contain, could force even the crown to turn its gaze. The Harringtons sensed change, though they could not name it. Ezekiel's sermons grew louder, as if shouting could hold back fate. Judith's eyes grew wild, her visions filled with blood and serpents. She clutched the twins tighter than ever, demanding loyalty, demanding worship, as if she could bind their hearts with fear alone, but fear is a fragile chain, and once it begins to rust, it cannot hold forever. The twins no longer whispered only to each other. Now they whispered to Father Thorn with urgency, with desperation. The plan had to come soon. They knew their parents would not wait forever. The air in the manor carried the scent of burning. Something was approaching something final. It was no longer a question of if the Harrington dynasty would fall, but of how much blood would be spilled before it did. The first cracks did not roar. They whispered. They began with villagers, who had once knelt eagerly for Ezekiel's blessings, now crossing the street to avoid his gaze. Merchants who once offered the Harringtons the finest cloth, now speaking of late payments and broken promises. Whispers of cursed blood trickled through taverns, where farmers drank cheap ale no longer in awe of the manor that loomed above them, but suspicious of the dark glow that seemed to cling to it like smoke. A shepherd swore he saw Judith kneeling at the well at midnight, chanting to water that turned black before his eyes. Children dared one another to approach the manor gates at dusk, claiming they heard the sound of crying, not from servants, not from nobles, but from something hidden within the walls. The Harrington name, which once carried the weight of reverence, now carried the taste of fear and unease. Father Thorn fanned the flames with invisible hands. He spoke to widows of vanished sons, to tradesmen cheated by false contracts, to servants dismissed with threats. He told them the truth, hidden in shadows, but never allowed enough to spark outrage, only enough to plant seeds of doubt. Soon every tavern conversation, every whispered gathering carried a shadow of the Harringtons' corruption. Ezekiel noticed the shift. His sermons grew harsher, his punishments swifter. Men were whipped in the square for speaking out. Women were branded as liars for questioning debts. Children were threatened with exile for repeating rumors. Yet the harder his grip tightened, the more the people slipped through his fingers. Judith, too, felt the storm brewing. She clung to her visions, declaring that angels still guarded their bloodline, but the people saw not angels, only demons wrapped in silk. The twins heard the murmurs every time they left the estate, their names spoken like curses or warnings. Gabriel and Raphael were no longer seen as heirs to power, but as inheritors of a curse. Yet within that curse lay freedom. The people's fear of the parents became the soil in which rebellion could grow. Father Thorn reminded them again and again that collapse begins not with fire, but with silence, broken by a single voice. The Harrington Empire was no longer unshakable. Its pillars quivered, its banners sagged, and beneath the stone floors of the manor, the children could almost hear the sound of chains loosening. The dynasty was not yet fallen, but it had begun to rot from the inside out. Father Thorn knew the hour was coming when silence would no longer suffice. He had gathered enough fragments of truth to weave into a weapon, but a weapon without hands to wield. It was nothing the people could not storm the manor without proof and survive the wrath that followed. Only Gabriel and Raphael held the keys for. They had seen what others had not. They had heard the whispers in the night, the arguments, the cries, the scratching of pens on forged wills and confessions. Their memories were chains that bound the Harringtons tighter than any prison could. In the candlelit chamber beneath the ruined chapel, Father Thorn spoke to the twins, his voice low yet sharp like steel. He told them that power built on blood cannot be toppled by stone or fire, but by truth carried by voices unafraid of breaking centuries of silence. He warned them that once they spoke, their words could never be taken back, that their parents would come for them with fury sharper than any blade, and that survival would mean surrendering the last threads of family that bound them. Gabriel sat silent, his crippled frame shaking not from weakness, but from the weight of decision. Raphael clenched his hands white with fury, his heart burning with the thought of justice long denied. Father Thorn placed his hands upon theirs, telling them that fear was a gift. It reminded them of danger, but it also sharpened courage, and courage would be their only shield when the world turned against the Harrington name. The plan was simple, yet perilous. The twins would speak not in shadows but before magistrates, before merchants, before the very villagers their parents had once ruled, with iron faith. Their testimony would be paired with the evidence salvaged from the manor's hidden rooms, parchments marked with blood ledgers filled with falsehoods, maps showing how entire estates had been stolen under the guise of divine punishment. Father, or Thorn would be the vessel, but the twins would be the flame. Every night they rehearsed the words. Every night they carved memory into armor. They practiced speaking without trembling, describing horrors without faltering. They learned to turn grief into a weapon, sharper than their parents. Cruelty, and in the quiet hours when doubts crept in. Father Thorn reminded them of the children whose bones lay in shallow graves, the families torn apart by false trials, the centuries of silence that demanded breaking. When dawn broke on the appointed day, the air over the village was thick with storm clouds, as if the heavens themselves weighed heavy with judgment. The Harringtons prepared their sermons, but the people no longer listened. They waited instead for two frail figures who would rise not as heirs but as witnesses, and the words they carried would shatter a dynasty. The courtroom smelled of damp wood and fear. The benches were filled with townsfolk, merchants, magistrates, even priests who had once praised the Harringtons as chosen vessels of divine wrath. The air trembled with whispers, but fell silent when the heavy door creaked open, and Gabriel and Raphael were carried inside. Frail bodies bound together by deformity, yet their eyes burned with a fire that made men twice their strength look away in shame. Father Thorn stepped forward, declaring before the court that the truth of years of blood crimes lay not in superstition, nor in the trembling testimonies of the frightened, but in the words of two children who had lived at the heart of darkness. Their voices were the only lantern that could pierce the abyss, and he warned the magistrates that to dismiss them would be to embrace the very corruption that had devoured New England from within. Gabriel spoke first, his voice shaking, but growing stronger with every syllable he described. Nights of screams, muffled beneath the manor floor. The ritualized punishments his parents had staged to mimic divine trials, while secretly orchestrating murders for property and influence. He recited names, dates the exact wording of false confessions his parents had forced from prisoners. Raphael followed his tone, harsher edged with fury, describing how Ezekiel and Judith mocked the villagers, calling them cattle who would swallow any lie if it bore the taste of Scripture. The evidence Father Thorn presented echoed their testimony, ledgers stained with blood, notations matching dates of executions, maps of seized land marked with symbols of death and deception. The magistrates shifted uneasily, sweat dripping down powdered wigs. The illusion of divine justice collapsed in their minds as the reality of greed, manipulation, and slaughter rose like a rotting specter. The villagers gasped. Some wept, others clenched their fists. In rage, the Harrington name, once spoken with reverence, now stank of betrayal. The court scribes recorded every word, as though they carved epitaphs for a dynasty of murder. Even the priests sat pale-faced, their lips pressed shut, unable to reconcile Scripture with the horrors unveiled before them. The silence after the twins finished was heavier than any sermon. The room held its breath, as though waiting for thunder. Yet it was not thunder, but the slow realization that the gods had never judged them. Only men had, and those men were monsters who walked in priestly robes and judicial gowns. The court could no longer deny it. The Harrington Empire was broken not by armies, nor flames, but by two children who refused to remain silent. The gavel struck against the wooden block like a hammer upon a coffin, sealing not only the fate of Ezekiel and Judith Harrington, but the illusion of justice they had built around themselves. The magistrates' voices wavered as they read the verdict. Posthumous convictions of murder fraud, corruption, and conspiracy. The list stretched longer than parchment should bear, and yet it still felt insufficient to weigh the enormity of their crimes. The townsfolk erupted into cries, some of grief, some of rage. Many could not comprehend how they had been deceived for so long by two figures who had cloaked themselves in divine righteousness. Neighbors remembered how Ezekiel had stood in the square, preaching of witchcraft while secretly arranging for the deaths of innocents. They recalled Judith's cold smile as she signed property deeds taken from corpses, her hand steady, her conscience absent, as the names of the victims were read aloud. A procession of widows, orphans, and broken men filled the courtroom, their faces etched with decades of loss. The magistrates faltered their authority, shaken by the tide of humanity now staring them down. The crimes were no longer lines on parchment. They were living wounds, walking the earth demanding redress. Father Thorne stood as witness to this transformation. He raised his hand, not in benediction, but in warning. He told the assembly that this was not the end, but the beginning. For the Harringtons were not lone wolves, but architects of a system. Their crimes thrived because others in power had chosen to look away to accept bribes to preserve their own comfort at the cost of blood. The people murmured agreement, realizing that evil had not lived only in the manor, but in the hearts of those who let the manor stand for nearly 2 decades. The verdict reverberated beyond the courtroom, spreading into taverns, churches, and marketplaces. The name Harrington became a curse, poken with spit on the tongue. Colonial authorities scrambled to undo the damage. Property restitution committees were formed. Corrupt officials were investigated. The fragile threads of trust in law and scripture strained near breaking. Yet in the midst of collapse, 2 fragile figures stood as proof that truth could survive, even when chained in darkness. Gabriel and Raphael were no longer seen as cursed children, but as bearers of light. Their testimony not only condemned their parents, but shattered an entire illusion of divine justice. The people looked to them now, not with pity, but with awe, as though they had rewritten the rules of survival. The collapse of the Harrington Empire did not end with the reading of verdicts. It spread like fire through the veins of colonial society, igniting scandals that reached far beyond the ashes of the manor. Every ledger found in the ruins became a weapon. Every parchment, a confession. The lists of properties seized from the dead were meticulously catalogued, their ink dark and fresh, as though the crimes had been written yesterday. Colonial authorities staggered under the weight of discovery, for the Harringtons had not only murdered, they had built a kingdom of wealth upon the bones of their victims. Deeds to farms, homes, and even entire estates lay bound in their vault, marked with signatures forged through fear and blood. Bribes to judges and ministers were tallied in neat columns with names and amounts. The evidence was so overwhelming, it forced even the most reluctant officials to confront their own complicity. Families who had lived in squalor for decades discovered that the homes of their ancestors had been stolen under false accusations of witchcraft. Children who had grown up fatherless now carried proof that their parents had been condemned, not by God, but by greed, as restitution. The colonial courts faced the impossible task of undoing years of theft. The returning of land and wealth was not merely legal work. It was the unearthing of graves for each property handed back, carried with it the story of a life unjustly taken. In taverns, men spoke in hushed voices about how deeply the rot had spread, how many other Harringtons might be hiding behind piety and position. The notion that witch trials could be tools of profit rather than divine justice struck terror into hearts and shook faith in the very foundations of authority. Ministers thundered from pulpits attempting to reclaim power, but whispers persisted that the church itself had been bought and bound by the siblings' gold. The process of dismantling their empire revealed the precision of their cruelty. Maps were uncovered with properties marked for future seizure, as though Ezekiel and Judith had planned their murders as carefully as one might plan a harvest. Projections of income from false trials lay beside lists of corrupt allies in other colonies. The realization dawned that the Harringtons had not been content with one town or one parish. They had intended to expand their kingdom of blood across New England. Yet in the wreckage, there was a strange kind of justice. The gold that had once purchased silence now funded schools for the poor. The lands soaked in blood were returned to descendants of the slain. The manor itself was left as ruin. A memorial, and a warning, a scar upon the earth reminding all that evil grows strongest when cloaked in sanctity and law. When Gabriel and Raphael were pulled from the ruins of Harrington Manor, the world expected to see broken shells of human life. Yet what emerged stunned both witness and scholar. The twins, frail and twisted from years of neglect, were still alive, their minds sharp, their spirits unbroken. It was as though survival itself had been their rebellion against the empire of cruelty that had raised them. Dr. William Harvey, a royal physician summoned from London, approached them not as curiosities but as mysteries, to be unraveled. His first examinations revealed a truth more horrifying than their appearance. Most of their deformities were not inevitable, but the result of calculated starvation, deliberate binding, and psychological manipulation, designed to keep them weak and dependent. The Harringtons had crippled their own children to maintain control, turning natural resilience into an illusion of helplessness. Under Harvey's care, the twins began to awaken to a life they had never been allowed to touch. Nourishment returned color to their faces. Therapy. Loosened muscles, long forced into stillness. Their movements, though halting, carried a strange dignity with each step. They unlearned the lies their parents had chained into their flesh. But the most shocking revelation came not from their bodies, but from their minds. Once freed from the shadows of fear, they demonstrated an intellect that towered above expectation. Within months, Gabriel and Raphael were reading at levels that outpaced grown men. They solved mathematical puzzles that baffled scholars. They sketched with artistry so refined it drew gasps from visiting intellectuals. The same children once mocked as monsters became proof that genius can bloom in the darkest soil. When cruelty no longer waters the roots, their brilliance became both a triumph and an indictment. It exposed not only the depths of the Harringtons' evil, but the blindness of a society that had accepted their deformity as evidence of lesser worth. Word of their progress spread through the colonies, stirring debate about the nature of intelligence and the cruelty of superstition. Ministers who had once condemned difference as a curse now found their sermons hollow against the living testimony of the twins. It was no longer possible to dismiss them as broken children, for they had become living arguments against centuries of prejudice. In Gabriel and Raphael, the world was forced to confront an unbearable truth, that much of what it called curse was in fact chains fastened by human hands, and that liberation, even after years of torment, could unlock powers that terrified those who thrived on control. When the courts called upon Gabriel and Raphael to testify, the chamber filled with unease, the crowd expected confusion, or the ramblings of children shattered by trauma. But what they heard instead was clarity, sharper than any blade. Each word carried the weight of memory carved into their minds by years of survival. They spoke of their parents, whispered bargains, the midnight visits of bribed officials, the careful planning of murders masked as witchcraft, and the division of property signed in blood and fear. Their testimonies did more than corroborate the records recovered from Harrington Manor. They humanized the crimes. They gave names, faces, and voices to the victims who had been silenced for decades. The twins described the cries they had heard from the attic, the weeping of neighbors dragged away on false charges, the quiet exchange of coins beneath tables that bought another death sentence, and the silence that always followed. Once property changed hands, each detail pierced the illusion of divine justice that the Harringtons had spun around their empire of corruption. Colonial authorities could not dismiss their words as fantasy, for their recollections aligned with documents, maps, and lists meticulously preserved in the ruins. The combination of living memory and written evidence was devastating. It exposed not only Ezekiel and Judith Harrington, but also the network of accomplices, judges, ministers, and landholders who had fed upon the slaughter of innocents for profit. The sight of the twins speaking from the witness stand, their frail forms framed against the cold architecture of the court, unsettled all who watched. Their intellect, their dignity, their unwavering gaze turned the proceedings into more than a trial. It became a reckoning. Every listener was forced to confront the question of how such children had endured, what countless adults had ignored or enabled their voices decay. Symbols of resistance testifying not only against their parents, but against an entire system that had allowed evil to masquerade as order. The impact rippled outward beyond the courthouse walls. Skeptics who once doubted the scale of corruption now stood in silence. Ministers who had preached fear found their authority shaken. Scholars who studied law recorded every word the twins spoke, for it was clear. History was being rewritten not by kings or generals, but by two children who had been caged and yet emerged with vision sharper than those who ruled over them. It was in those hours of testimony that Gabriel and Raphael ceased to be victims and became architects of change. Their words dismantled a dynasty of terror and forced a society to admit that its greatest monsters had never been witches, but men in power cloaked in robes of respectability. The final chapter of the Harrington saga was not written in blood or fire, but in reform and transformation. What Gabriel and Raphael endured became the foundation for changes that would echo for centuries. Their survival proved that even from within cages of cruelty, a force could rise that no chain could silence. Gabriel the scholar bent his mind toward law. His writings on evidence, judicial corruption, and witness protection spread across the colonies. His knowledge, born not from books, but from scars, inspired reforms that shielded children and vulnerable witnesses from manipulation. He argued that testimony should never be dismissed because of youth or disability, and his words reshaped the way justice was delivered across the Atlantic world. His ideas planted the seeds of modern witness protection protocols, his life a reminder that the law must guard the weak, not weaponize their frailty. Raphael turned to medicine, healing not only with his hands, but with philosophy. He founded a school for children with disabilities, teaching that physical difference was not a curse, but a variation of human potential. His method treated patients as whole beings, not broken bodies. He challenged physicians, priests, and parents to see dignity where others saw shame. His school became a beacon, proving that education and care could unlock brilliance in those once cast aside. Together, the twins lived as testimony that cycles of evil could be broken. They married, raised families, and watched as their children grew free of the deformities and corruption that had marked their birth. The curse of Ezekiel and Judith ended with them replaced by a lineage built upon resilience, wisdom, and compassion. Their very existence refuted the belief that blood alone defines destiny. Colonial America itself shifted beneath the weight of their story. Father Thorne's methods of evidence gathering and protection reshaped both church and court systems. The ruins of Harrington Manor were consecrated as a memorial, a grave not only for two criminals, but for the illusions of fear and superstition that had permitted their rise. Etched into stone was the truth. Gabriel and Raphael wished the world never to forget. Evil is not supernatural. It is a choice repeated whenever men value comfort over conscience. Their lives became arguments for child protection, disability rights, and the recognition that resilience can defy even the most monstrous circumstances. They showed that individuals once dismissed as broken could become the architects of progress. Their triumph revealed that the human spirit, when nurtured, refuses to remain silent, refuses to remain chained. And so the Harrington legacy endures, not as a tale of horror, but as a warning and a challenge. Evil thrives when silence reigns. Justice survives when voices rise, even the smallest, even the weakest, even those once caged.